Public opinion and political participation. Public opinion can be defined as a combination of the views, attitudes, and ideas held by individuals in a community. There's no single public opinion. There's a wide range of viewpoints. Different people think differently about politics. Political opinions differ in ideological orientation, intensity with which they're held, and the degree of sophistication. The level of intensity with which an opinion is held is likely to influence whether that opinion will determine how the person participates politically. For example, a person who is vehemently, passionately pro-choice is likely to vote for pro-choice candidates based mostly or entirely on his or her pro-choice view. A person who is slightly leaning pro-choice in his or her opinion is likely to decide how to vote based on that opinion, but less so than the person who feels a great deal of intensity about this issue. A substantial share of the American public does not care too much about politics, and in fact knows relatively little about it, and does not think about politics in very sophisticated terms. Public opinion, unsophisticated as it may be, is crucial in most modern societies, especially in democratic ones. Public discontent can give rise to anger and political instability, including major strikes, riots, and revolutions. Modern politicians simply cannot afford to ignore public opinion. Even though the American public expresses relatively high levels of interest in politics when responding to interviewers' questions, the public's actual knowledge of politics is low. For example, in 2007, in one survey, 19% of Americans had never heard of Nancy Pelosi, who became the first woman Speaker of the House of Representatives in January of that year. A 1999 survey found that 24% could not name the country from which the United States gained its independence. So 1 in 4 people did not know which country the US gained its independence from. Now, as far as the extreme pride in being an American, that measure remains near record lows. The record lows that the Gallup captured were in 2022, when 38% of respondents said that they're extremely proud to be an American. In 2023, this was only 1 percentage point higher at 39%. Now, 67% of US adults are extremely or very proud to be American. So when you combine extremely proud with very proud, that rises to 67%. There's a difference between Republicans, Independents, and Democrats on this metric. 60% of Republicans, but only 33% of Independents and 29% of Democrats are extremely proud. At the same time, 22% of American adults currently say that they're moderately proud, while 7% are only a little and 4% not at all. So those who are only a little proud and those who are not at all proud combined are 11%, barely in double digits. And so those who are not at all proud are just at 4%, which is an encouraging metric because it suggests that people who dislike the United States, they are just 4% of adults. Partisans' extreme pride in being American. So here, if you're watching this lecture, then you can see over time how this has changed during the 21st century. So we started the century with 64% of Republicans being extremely proud, 54% of Democrats, and only 46% of Independents. And by the time that we reach the end of 2023, we see that Republican measure of this fell slightly to 60%, so it went down from 64 to 60. The metric for Independents went down from 46 to 33, and the metric for Democrats went down from 54 to 29. So the Democrats is where the drop-off is really at. It's a significant drop-off, almost by 50%, from 54% to 29%. That's an almost 50% drop in about a quarter of a century from being extremely proud, so that's a quite a number. Extreme pride in being American remains near record lows, as I have just mentioned. Another statistic that I think that it behooves me to mention is that since 2018, extreme pride has consistently been below 50%. So it's been over 5 years now, and we are consistently below 50%. And currently, the rolling average is 42%. Even for institutions that are sometimes singled out as objects of public disdain in the United States, such as the media and Congress, Americans traditionally have had more confidence in them than have their European counterparts. This may be changing with the recent drop-off in American pride, but traditionally since World War II, Americans have felt more proud of their respective institutions than Europeans have of theirs. Now, what about institutions who tend to be the targets of disapproval, if not derision? Congress is one of those institutions. In recent surveys, only roughly 20% of the American people approve of the job Congress is doing. So the latest measurements that I have is that for September of 2023, according to Gallup poll, only 17% of American adults have expressed approval of the job that Congress is doing. Next is political culture. Political culture can be understood as a meta-ideology. Meta mean above or beyond. So political culture is a distillation of the values and ideas of the mainstream ideological range. And in the United States, the mainstream ideological range is essentially from liberal to conservative to libertarian. So these are the main ideologies, and people who subscribe to other ideologies make up a minuscule percentage of American adults. And so political culture is what you can extract from that range. It's the derivative. It's what is common in terms of values and ideals from that range. And these are ideals such as equality, particularly equality of opportunity, freedom, meaning individual freedom, consent of the governed, meaning the government has the right to rule because the people have consented, capitalism and free enterprise, the free enterprise system. Ronald Reagan, who in 1984 was the archetypical example, the archetype of that political culture, who represented those, values, won the 1984 election carrying 49 states. So if you compare that to his first victory in 1980, his 1980 campaign was more substantive, and he won it by a smaller margin. In 1984, he ran a far less substantive campaign, a campaign much more based on ideals, and he won that overwhelmingly, matching Richard Nixon's record of 1972, carrying, as I said, 49 states. Now, the American people may disagree on the exact meaning of equality, where the line should be drawn between freedom and the interests of society, right? How far should individual freedom go? They also disagree on how far the government should go to protect minority rights, how much economic regulation there should be. And of course, on ideology and political worldview, they also disagree. Although, as I said, the ideological mainstream in the United States is quite limited. So despite all of these disagreements, there's huge intercontinental, from coast to coast, let's not call it intercontinental, although it may be to some extent, because the United States extends into the Caribbean, extends far into the Pacific. So this gigantic society, which is very diverse racially, ethnically, religiously, culturally, economically, nevertheless has been remarkably cohesive. Now we move from the general point of political culture to much more specific measurements of public opinion. What we want to do is to have public opinion polls that are scientific. And scientific public opinion polls are based on random sampling. So random means that every person in the population has an equal chance of being selected. So you cannot interview the entire population because you don't have enough time or money to do so. And what you want to do is to take a representative sample. And representative sample is a random sample. Every respondent has an equal chance of being selected. So randomness ensures representativeness. And no matter how random your poll really is, every poll has a margin of error. Few scientific polls that study public opinion have more than 1,000 respondents, and almost none go beyond 1,500. You shouldn't be using quota sampling and self-selected sampling, because these are likely to produce inaccurate results. So quota sampling is when you say, instead of selecting respondents at random, I'm going to superimpose some kind of collection of metrics, some kind of set of parameters. So I'm going to say that a certain percentage of respondents should be of this race and that race, and should be this gender, that gender, or this occupation or that occupation. You can't do it because this will not yield results that are as accurate as when respondents are selected at random, because there's always some kind of intervening variable that you can overlook, and the end result will be a sample that is skewed. So you want to leave it up to chance for respondents to be selected. Obviously self-selected samples are not scientific, because people who volunteer to be interviewed, right? People who volunteer for samples are different than people who do not. There can be a variety of reasons why they are different. So again, go with random sampling. Margin of error and confidence interval. The margin of error for random sample of 1,000 is plus minus 3.1% at the confidence level of 95%. This means that there's a 95% probability that if you interview 1,000 respondents at random, the margin of error will be within 3.1%. And the margin of error will be no more than 4.1% with the probability of 99%. So if you take the following hypothetical example, right, of the properly performed poll of 1,000 likely voters in a state, let's say just before election day, and you've got a Republican candidate with 45%, Democrat 43%, all other parties 6%, undecided 5%, and those who declined to state 1%. So we have to understand, in a poll of 1,000 likely voters, the true margin of error approaches 5%. That is to say, if you want to make a prediction with nearly 100% accuracy, the margin of error may be as high as 5%. If you only want to predict it with 95% accuracy, then the margin of error is 3.1%. Okay. So this is why when we just look at raw numbers, and then on election day the results don't match the raw numbers of a particular poll, we may be too hasty in accusing a given poll of being in error. It's not necessarily in error, because again, there's a margin of error. So 45 versus 43, and then the Democrat who only had 43 the day before the election defeats the Republican who had 45. Well, you have to understand there's almost 5% margin of error. So Democrat could have been as high as 48, 43 plus 5, 48. And Republican could have been as low as 40, because 45 minus 5 is 40. So we always have to look at each poll's sample size, and keep in mind the margin of error associated with it. Determining likely voters. Any determination on who is or who is not likely to vote prior to September of the election year may contain a significant degree of error. Most voters are not fully engaged in the election until after Labor Day of the election year. Identifying likely voters is a difficult task for election pollsters. More respondents say they intend to vote than will actually vote, so people want to come across as being interested and politically engaged. So they overstate their own likelihood of actually voting. To control for this distortion, most pollsters use a combination of questions that narrow down who truly intends to vote. Because different pollsters use different sets of questions to identify likely voters, their polling results may vary. Pollsters use a lengthy set of questions and based on those answers assign a score on a likely voter scale. An example of a set of questions used to determine likely voters: how much thought have you given to the coming presidential election? How closely have you been following news about the candidates? Do you plan to vote in the presidential election? How certain are you that you will vote? Rate your chance of voting in November on a scale of 10 to 1, with 10 being definitely will vote and 1 definitely will not vote. How often do you follow what's going on in government and public affairs? Have you ever voted in your precinct or election district? How often would you say you vote? Do you happen to know where people in your neighborhood go to vote? In the last election, did things come up that kept you from voting, or did you vote? So all of these questions are meant to be controls. Based on past experiences, these questions are effective in winnowing down the field of actual voters, actual likely voters, versus those who only say they're likely to vote. Determining likely voters gets more accurate closer to election day. In the past 3 presidential elections, Pew Research Center surveys conducted in September and October found little difference between election estimates based on registered voters and those they identified as likely voters. On the eve of the election, the surveys found a much wider difference. This pattern suggests that determining who is a likely voter gets more accurate as election day nears. Gallup uses a similar question model for determining likely voters. Polls, the question of wording. So, how do you word questions? Wording and question order both are important. Wording should be neutral and loaded questions must be avoided. So you shouldn't ask respondents questions like, would you be more or less likely to vote for candidate A if you knew that candidate A is okay with terrible things like child pornography? Because when you ask a question like that, there's already a substantive assumption. There's already substance built into this question. And there's already an ideological tinge of approval and disapproval. So clearly, if you ask someone if you're going to support a candidate based on the terrible things he has done, or knowing if you knew that he had done those things, clearly that's a loaded question. And questions should even avoid giving any impression that an interviewer prefers a particular answer. So the choice of words and the tone of voice should be neutral and should avoid giving any impression that you as an interviewer favor a particular answer. And also the order of questions, like I said, is important because if you start with simple questions, the ones that are very easy to answer, respondents will be more invested in the interview and will be less likely to terminate it. If you start with complex questions, they're much more likely to cut the interview short, and then you won't get your answers. Your project will fail because your interviews will be incomplete. Professional polling firms tend to use tracking polls to calculate a rolling average, and most of those are between 3 and 6 days. This is to smooth out the impact of the news cycle, and also to ensure that you really can implement your random sample model, whatever it is based on, be it based on randomly generated phone numbers or online randomly generated online surveys, because sometimes in 1 or 2 days it may be impossible for technical reasons to get to all the randomly chosen respondents. How to read poll results. So one site that many political scientists use is realclearpolitics.com, and there's a variety of polls there. The polls that measure the president's approval rating tend to be quite popular, and I recommend that everyone goes to realclearpolitics.com and checks those out. So how do you read a poll? First, you will see on the left-hand side, you will see the name of the polling firm, followed by the dates, the range of dates when the poll was taken, followed by sample size, and then followed by letters, LV, RV, or the letter A. And then, of course, by results, approve, disapprove, and the spread between the two. So now we can actually look at what those letters LV, RV, and A mean. A stands for adults, RV for registered voters, LV for likely voters. A, or adults, is best used when one wants to measure the mood of the country. So if you want to get a feeling for what the people think, then you use a sample of adults. If you want to predict election results, then of course the best sample is that of LV, likely voters. And we saw a minute ago that measuring likely voters is actually more time-consuming and expensive than measuring registered voters, because you have to ask all of those control questions, and there are many of them. And because of that, most polling firms, most of the time, will use RV and not LV to measure things like the president's approval rating, congressional approval rating, and only when we get close, like weeks, days before the election day, will they en masse switch to LV. Now, there are some polling firms like Rasmussen who do use LV pretty much on a continuous basis, but most will use RV until, like I said, it gets really close to election day. Polls for entertainment and polls for abuse. Now, website, radio, and television call-in polls, and also street interviews, they can be fun, and no harm is done so long as the viewers and participants understand that the results are not representative of the population in general, or even of the listeners or viewers, because the respondents are self-selected. Right? So on the street, you approach the people that are convenient for you to approach, and many just tell you to go pound sand, and they just don't respond. So those you approach and those who respond are likely to be different than a random sample of whichever population you want to measure, right? So polls like the ones that you see on YouTube on the channel Flickr Talks, where this guy, I think Jason is his name, when he interviews young people and then based on those interviews gives provocative titles to his videos like Humiliating, Generation Z Cannot Answer Simple Questions. What we have to understand is it's not a random sample of Generation Z. It's a convenience sample of the people he met on the streets of a particular city. In his case, it seems to be primarily New York. And it's just the people who chose to answer his questions, and it's just the people that he decided to show. We don't know how many outtakes actually took place and how many very bright young people who gave correct answers to the questions he might have excluded. So as long as we understand that this is entertainment, I think no harm is done. However, where harm is done is when you get to push polls. And if you live long enough, you will encounter those. And push polls are actually designed to influence public opinion under the guise of asking questions. So they rely on asking loaded questions, similar to the one that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And there's been a really sad history of those being used in this country. So a push poll is neither scientific nor amusing. A push poll is there on false pretenses. Like I said, under the guise of measuring public opinion, it attempts to influence it in the direction of a particular candidate or a particular issue. Focus groups. Focus groups are used to find out what is relevant to a particular group. The reason why you need to know what is relevant is because you can ask all kinds of questions and have a proper scientifically selected random sample, get accurate results, put those results in a computer, analyze them, and come up with a research paper or come up with a useful political summary for your candidate. But what you come up with may be irrelevant because you didn't ask the right questions. So statistical accuracy is not the same as relevance of issues, right? So if you ask voters about, foreign policy, how they feel about foreign policy, or how they feel about, I don't know, the environment, you may not be, and that's all you ask about, you may not have asked all the right questions. So focus groups may be important in order to narrow down what is and is not relevant. And in politics, it's typically undecided voters, because undecided voters, we know from experience, tend to, in the end, determine how general elections go, right? So in presidential elections, very often it's the 5 to 10% of undecided voters who are neither passionately Republican or Democrat will sway the election one way or another. And so you want to have a moderator who asks open-ended questions of his particular focus group or her particular focus group. And like I said, it's very often it's undecided voters, in order to tease out what is in fact relevant to them, you see. And then on the basis of that, you know which questions to ask, and you can, instead of asking open-ended questions during a focus group interview, following that, you can ask closed-ended questions like yes or no, support, don't support. So focus groups, like I said, they involve a moderator. Interviews can be structured or semi-structured. Structured interviews are more restrictive. So the moderator in a structured interview would use a fixed preset questions in order in which he or she had listed them. In a semi-structured interview, the moderator would have more discretion and would vary the order and the phrasing of the questions. Now, the topic of public opinion does not have to be boring. In fact, it can be a fascinating topic. And I would urge everyone to check out at least the Gallup poll website, at least the Pew Research Center website, and of course, Real Clear Politics, to familiarize themselves with the basics of public opinion. Thank you for your attention.